Speech at the Oxford Union went viral online after he argued that British rule had destroyed India's future. Let's see a bit of that speech.
The fact is that India was already Britain's biggest cash cow, the world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports, and the source of highly paid employment for British civil servants. We literally paid for our own oppression.
We paid for our own oppression. Dr. Thoreau will be joining us very shortly for more on that. Is he right, though? Tommy has been to Liverpool, a port city which thrived on Britain's colonial growth, to find out what people there think.
What do you know about the British Empire?
That Britain rule other countries? Well, not rule. They like help rule other countries?
They're sort of like involved in a lot of the countries around the world.
The British Empire, it's a very imperialistic and in the past very arrogant situation.
We used to have like Australia and India and all those other countries around there, but I don't really know that much about it.
I believe that we brought a lot of freedom to people, a lot of opportunities to countries which probably didn't have them in the past.
The Redcoats marched all over the world and plundered the place. They turned up in places like Africa and said, "We're here," and that was it.
They ruled India at the time, yeah, in the 19th century and 18th century. When they did go there, they brought all the diamonds and everything down here, which Queen got at the moment.
Are you proud of the British Empire and the fact that we ruled a big part of the world?
Yeah, because it proves power. It proves that we are a powerful little country.
Are you proud of the British Empire?
Very much so, yes, yeah.
I'm proud of being part of the UK, but English history I'm not that proud of, no. I think half the problems we've got today are to do with the history of the English, not the British, the English.
Who's benefited?
Us. We've gone and we've robbed natural resources such as gold, oil, diamonds, trees. We've killed wildlife, we've killed indigenous people.
You can't live in the past, we know that, but I certainly think it had more benefits than anything else.
We've introduced parliaments and democracy voting, elections for people, one man, one vote type of thing.
Do you think we're now compensating for what the Brits did by letting immigrants into the country now?
Absolutely not, no. No, 2 million Indians fought for us in World War II, and people go on about the immigrants that come from India. If it wasn't for these people that came from these countries, we'd have lost.
I think it's time now that we've got such an influence on the countries. It's sort of like, okay, well, we'll give back some of the stuff that we took from you, yeah?
So they should compensate India, they should give it back now?
Yeah, exactly, you know. It's been ages now. They should pay it with interest, as a matter of fact.
I don't think you can compensate. How do you compensate something like that? I think we should learn our lessons.
I would probably say to them, the past is the past and we're not responsible for the past. That we should all just now get on together.
We should all get on together. The past is the past and we're not responsible for it. What are your thoughts at home? Do email us, text us, call or use social media to get in touch. Should Britain pay compensation to its former colonies? With interest, as that gentleman said. We're going to find out what our guests think in just a moment. First, though, let's hear from the man who suggested that, Dr. Sashi Thoreau, who joins us from Edinburgh this morning. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Your country, India, is tipped as a future superpower. Do you need Britain's money or apologies?
Well, superpower is something else. I'm afraid we're still super poor. So it's a while before we can contemplate superpower status, and I'm not sure we should. But that's another debate. I think as far as the reparations issue is concerned, what I suggested at Oxford was that what was important was the principle that a debt was owed, not a sum of money, because as somebody said in that extract earlier, you can't quantify human suffering. What you can do, of course, is to make a gesture, and I suggested £1 a year for each of the next 200 years to make up for the last 200.
And what would that amount to in your sums?
£200. I mean, the point is, there have been calculations made by people, and they're impossible to fulfil. I mean, somebody has suggested a figure of £3.4 trillion sterling, and which is far larger than your economy and far larger than you would be able to pay over the next 200 years. So I think that sort of debate is pointless. And the kinds of things I was talking about, the depredations, the dramatic reduction of India's share of global GDP from 23% when the British came to 4% when the British left, the collapse of India's exports from 27% when the British came to 2% when the British left, all of these things, and then the loss of human lives, something like 15 to 29 million Indians died unnecessary deaths in man-made famines during British rule. And the fact is, you cannot put a price on all of this.
Sure.
So reparations in monetary terms is pointless, but the principle of atonement, not just apology, but of atonement, is why I suggested £1 a year.
What about the other things that Britain perhaps left India? So parliamentary democracy, you may have heard one of our guests speaking about that earlier in Liverpool. Also the rule of law, the protection of rights, the English language, a very good railway system which still employs 1.6 million Indians. Are you really saying that when Britain left India with nothing?
No, but I am saying that Britain left India a lot worse off than it would have been without Britain. As far as the railways are concerned, for example, which is frequently trotted out as an example, the railways were a wonderful British scam. They were built for British convenience, to get Britons around, and particularly, above all, to move Indian raw materials to the ports to be shipped to Britain, where very often they were manufactured into goods and shipped right back to India, where we paid extortionate prices for them. What is more, in building the railways, the British offered such extravagant guaranteed rates of return to British private investors that every line of railway in India cost double what the same mile would have cost in Canada or Australia. It was, as it was pointed out at the time, private enterprise, British private enterprise, at public risk, Indian public risk. It was essentially a colonial scam. It had nothing to do with the convenience of Indians or the demands for mass transport by Indians, because the railway lines were not constructed to serve that purpose. They were constructed, as everything else was, to serve British purposes.
Thank you, Dr. Thoreau, for those points. Alison, Britain effectively took out more than it put in, and it's a colonial scam.
Well, I've read a little bit about this, and there are some people who would say the opposite. As for being a scam, I don't agree with that at all. I'm proud of our British heritage. I think Britain did extremely well with the British Empire, but I think in 1947, when we pulled out from India and they had their independence, was absolutely right. Of course we made mistakes, but we were never brutal to people who were in the empire, as other
Amritsar massacre?
As other countries were.
The famines you just spoke about? You're saying that wasn't brutal?
Well, it wasn't all to do with the British. Of course it wasn't.
The Amritsar massacre wasn't to do with the British of 1919?
I don't know.
Have you read what happened after what the British rather arrogantly called the Indian Mutiny, when they asked Hindu and Muslim sepoys to bite on cartridges which contained forbidden animal fats? Their punishment for not doing that was the most appalling acts of genocide by the British: torture of Muslims, wrapping them up in pigskins, putting men in cannon guns and shooting them into the air.
And the Hindus were supposed to be eating something to do with the cow.
But, I know, but I mean, you can't say that there was no brutality.
But there was very little compared with other nations.
Well,
okay.
6.1 million people died in one famine alone. That's very little, is it?
The Amritsar massacre, 379 Indians were killed in the Amritsar massacre. David Cameron in 2013 went almost as far as an apology, saying, I don't think the right thing to do is reach back into history and seek out things you can apologise for, but he certainly acknowledged that that level of brutality did take place.
I'm the first to hold up my hand and say we got things wrong. Of course we did. We're human, and by human nature we will make mistakes. But by and large, I think we didn't do at all badly when we had the British Empire, and looking after India and all the things you've mentioned, which are the positives.
Should we atone for the things that we got wrong in the past?
I think probably I think empire building is probably something the world should stay away from. And if you look at most empires, from the Roman Empire, what are we going to ask the Italians to start apologising to us? I don't think there's much point in apologising. I think that's a rather silly thing. But I don't think we should be wrapped up with the idea that Britain is better than everywhere else, that we are a great nation, that we've never done anything. We've done, I mean, go back to the Crusades, the sort of things we did to people. You know, we've moved on. Hopefully, we're living in a world that can become better than it has been. Maybe we can learn from our mistakes, and there were mistakes.
I think you're right in terms of humility, but I think on top of that, you have to acknowledge, I mean, for example, in Australia, with Aboriginal Australians, with, you know, the reconciliation movement was a very big movement, and I was actually involved in that for some time when I was over there, and I think it was very important because it gives people a sense of dignity and a sense that they've actually moved on from something, that they can park all their resentment historically.
So an apology is quite important?
I think an apology is very
important. Well, the Queen apologised to the Maoris not long ago, very courteous of her, for what we'd done to the Maoris. The Maoris didn't return the courtesy and say that they'd eaten a boatload of Captain Cook's comrades, but, I mean, there's no need for everybody to apologise all the time. Of course there isn't.
Well, is there a reason for compensation?
What I think we should be doing, and I don't agree with the MP, actually, who's just spoken, the Indian, that we can't do anything in order to compensate, because I think nearly all the problems in the world today, from the Middle East, the boat people coming over the Mediterranean and so forth, are post-colonial problems, and we should be giving far more in overseas aid, far more. I mean,
well, Britain gave £269 million in aid to India in 2013.
Yes.
You think more should be given?
I don't know about the Indian economy.
Where are we going to get the more money from?
But I think that
it's a very wealthy country.
I'm not talking about India now, but I'm talking about the people who are involved in these refugee crises, for example. They are all, in one way or another, escaping situations which were the creation of European imperial powers. We made a total mess intervening in the Middle East and continue to do so. Ditto North Africa, ditto Horn of Africa, and as European beings, and whether it was a British colony, an Italian colony, whatever it might be, we made the mess. These people, generations later, are still suffering from it. So therefore, we are obliged to help, not just with apologies, which of course are right, but with a crippling level, in my opinion. We should be prepared to reduce our own wealth in this country and help other people in the world who are suffering post-colonial problems.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think reparations are always the way to go, because obviously that led to the rise of nationalism in Germany when they were paying war reparations to America. But I think, and that's obviously very dangerous. But my point is, you don't want to build resentment in the country, but at the same time, you have to acknowledge something that you know, that for me was a fundamental wrong. And I think, and that's what I'm talking about in other countries. And I think that where that has happened, it's given more of a sense of, you know, like I said, dignity to the people.
Dr. Tharoor, can I come back to you? Is this a big issue in India? Do Indian people tell you that this is what they want? They want apologies, and in some cases they would like some form of reparation?
Well, actually, I'm afraid, you know, I'm guilty of having made it one. It wasn't a big issue. This was the topic dreamed up by the bright students at the Oxford Union for their debate. But when my video went viral, it certainly ignited a national debate. And there was overwhelming public sentiment in favour of my argument, and the Prime Minister himself, no less, spoke publicly in support of what I'd had to say. So it did turn out to be a bigger issue, and I suppose the fact that we're discussing it now on the BBC suggests that it has ignited some reflection in various parts of the world. If I could comment on a couple of things that were said earlier. The Amritsar massacre, for example, Jallianwala Bagh, was actually took 1,741 victims, not just the 300-odd you mentioned. And the tragedy is that this was done to a group of completely unarmed protesters who were protesting a particularly iniquitous law imposed by the British commanding officer, General Dyer, which obliged Indians to crawl on all fours through a street. And they'd gathered to protest this absurd instruction when he opened fire and killed so many of them. So it really, this is the kind of brutality we've seen, I'm afraid, the destruction of the textile weavers' livelihoods in Bengal, when many weavers' thumbs were cut off and their looms were smashed so they couldn't continue their livelihoods. Dhaka, now the capital of Bangladesh, was depopulated.
Do you not think that those atrocities, sorry to interrupt you and forgive me, but when David Cameron went on a visit to Amritsar, he did say, we're dealing with something here that happened a good 40 years before I was born, and the British government rightly condemned it at the time. So do we need to keep atoning and saying sorry for things that happened way in the past?
But would you say the same thing to the Chinese and the Koreans who are demanding apologies from the Japanese right now? The fact is, there's hardly anyone alive in Japan who was responsible for any atrocity committed during the Japanese occupation of these countries. But the principle is important. We all remember, I think, of my generation, that historic picture of Willy Brandt on his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in Poland. I mean, he was a socialist. He had nothing to do with Nazi crimes. But the fact is, today's Britain was built on the proceeds of its rapacity in India in great part, and not just India and the other colonies as well. You know, the Jane Austen novels and the lifestyle they depicted were made possible by money from the plantations in the Caribbean.
Alison just wanted to come back on one point.
The people of Britain, it seems to me, are living today as the heirs of this iniquity and this colonial exploitation. And therefore, they can't really say that they have nothing to do with it. I do agree they don't have to pay for it in a monetary sense.
Okay.
I would like to say, what about the corruption that's present in India at the moment? I've lived in India for a year, and I know the corruption was absolutely appalling. It hasn't changed. India could be much better for the people who are so poor if they looked after their own in a far better way. And if we give money in reparation, if that was to happen, where will it go? It'll go into pockets of people and line their pockets. It will not help the poor.
All right, Tommy, what are people
Sian,
saying
it's trending online on social media. Lots of comments. Do look up the hashtag if you want to see what some of the other comments are. But George here saying, Britain is arguably the most invaded country in the world. So are we now going to sue the Celts, the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings and the Normans for attacking Britain?
That's brilliant.
Also, Jason saying, pay them for what? Building their nation. Every other country in the area is in a right state except for the former colony India. Coincidence? He doesn't think so. Baraz is saying, don't stop with India. All the other victims of the empire, including Kenyan and other former colonies, should also be compensated. And Paul has got in touch and he's saying, we should be made to pay for compensation. We should be made to pay compensation for the upheaval that we leave behind when a country is no longer useful to us.
Tommy, thank you very much. Mentioned Kenya, of course. There was compensation for the Mau Mau uprising, which was paid in 2013. That was £20 million. But I quite like that text as well, saying, are we going to sue the Romans and the Vikings and the Saxons? I mean, where do you stop, Andrew?
Well, I don't think it would be much use suing the Italians at the moment, poor things, because I don't think they've got very much money. But we could try beating up the Celts again, I suppose, if you wanted to.
No, we've had enough beating up, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to all of you and to you at home as well. And thank you to Dr. Taror for joining us there from Edinburgh.